The American cobbler trade had been practiced continuously on the North American continent for nearly 300 years before its destruction in a single working generation. The first colonial cobbler shops opened in Plymouth in the 1620s, and the trade grew steadily across every American community for nearly 3 centuries afterward. By 1970, the United States still supported more than 75,000 working cobblers operating in every state of the country at all economic levels. By 2010, fewer than 7,000 working cobblers remained in business, and the trade had effectively collapsed across most of the American landscape and most American towns. A trade that had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of the factory, and the suburbanization of America, was destroyed in a single working generation. The destruction was concentrated in a single decade, between roughly the late 1990s and the late 2000s, in a pattern unlike any other American working trade. 300 years of continuous practice were eliminated in roughly 10 years by a combination of cheap imports, consumer culture marketing, and deliberate decisions made in American schools. Welcome to Forgotten Trades Vault. Before we open this vault, hit subscribe so the next archive finds its way to you. The archive opens in 1790 in Lynn, Massachusetts, where the American cobbler trade first organized into a coherent industrial cluster of working shops. In 1790, Lynn was already the shoemaking capital of the United States, with more cobbler shops per capita than any other community in the country. The town had been a center of colonial shoemaking since the 1630s, when English immigrant cordwainers had established the first organized shops in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. By the time of the American Revolution, Lynn was producing more than 400,000 pairs of shoes annually, mostly through small home workshops scattered across the town. The shoes were sold throughout the colonies and exported to the West Indies, with Lynn cobblers supplying much of the working footwear of the early American economy in the period. By 1790, the town supported more than 200 working cobbler shops, with nearly every household in the community engaged in some part of the shoemaking process. Men cut the leather and assembled the uppers. Women stitched the binding and the linings, and children pegged the soles and finished the edges of the completed shoes for sale. The trade was woven into the daily economic life of the community at every level, from the formal master cobbler down to the youngest apprentice in training under his roof. A young man entering the trade in 1790 could expect a 7-year apprenticeship in the household of a master cobbler. The apprentice emerged at age 21, ready to open his own shop, with the tools, the customer base, and the reputation needed to support a family. The colonial cordwainer system was distinguished from the cobbler in original English usage, with the cordwainer making new shoes from new leather and the cobbler repairing existing footwear. By the 1850s, the two terms had merged in American usage, and a single craftsman typically did both kinds of work in his shop in regular operation. The Lynn cobbler tradition spread across New England through the early 19th century, with similar clusters developing in Brockton, Haverhill, and other Massachusetts towns nearby in the region. By the 1860s, Massachusetts produced more than half of all shoes manufactured in the United States, supplied largely by the working cobblers of Lynn and the surrounding region. The introduction of the Mackay stitching machine in 1862 and the Goodyear welt machine in 1872 transformed the shoe manufacturing industry permanently. The machines allowed factory production of shoes at scale, dramatically reducing the cost of new shoes and changing the nature of the cobbler trade across the country in significant ways. But the machines did not destroy the trade, they simply reorganized it, as the factories built the new shoes and the independent cobblers repaired, restored, and customized them. The factory shoe was an entry point into the cobbler shop, not a substitute, with the cobbler extending the life of every shoe across 2 or 3 cycles of resoling. A pair of well-made factory shoes from 1900 could last 20 years with periodic resoling and rehealing, generating ongoing revenue for the local cobbler across decades. The relationship between the shoe factory and the cobbler shop was complementary rather than competitive, with both segments expanding together across the early 20th century. By 1900, the United States supported more than 150,000 working cobblers, with the trade more widely distributed across the country than ever before in history. Every American town of more than 2,000 residents supported at least one working cobbler, and larger cities supported dozens of shops in their main commercial districts and side streets. The cobbler shop was a fixture of American small-town life, wedged between the barber shop and the hardware store on every main street across the 19th century. The shop window was filled with finished shoes hanging from brass hooks and the smell of leather, neat's foot oil. The cobbler worked from a wooden bench surrounded by curved knives, awls, hammers. A customer who had used the shop for 10 years had his own dedicated last in the cobbler's inventory, ready for his next pair of shoes or his next repair. The cobbler remembered every customer by name, by foot, and by the pattern of wear on their previous shoes that no chain retailer could ever match anywhere. For 2 centuries, this scene was repeated in nearly every American town with a population above 200. The trade took apprentices from the local community, trained them in shop, and returned them to the same community as working professionals who served their neighbors for decades after. The Civil War strengthened the trade as both armies needed enormous quantities of boot repair work to keep their soldiers in the field across years of campaigns across the country. The First World War strengthened it again as European leather supplies were disrupted, and American shops had to do more with less material on hand. The Great Depression actually expanded the trade, as families that could not afford new shoes paid the cobbler to extend the life of the old ones. The Second World War expanded it further, with rationing of leather and rubber, forcing every American household to repair rather than replace footwear for nearly 4 years of war. Each citizen received a ration book that permitted only 1 or 2 new pairs of shoes per year during the war years, making the cobbler effectively a federally critical worker. A small-town cobbler in 1950 earned roughly $6,000 to $9,000 a year, against a median American household income of about $3,000 annually. The cobbler out-earned the average grade school teacher in his town, the local newspaper editor, and many of his customers, while serving them honestly and reliably across decades of work. The average new house in America cost about $12,000 at that time. He owned his shop, his tools, his inventory, and his customer relationships outright, and answered to no one above him in any organizational chart or corporate hierarchy whatsoever. He took apprentices when he chose to and trained them at his own pace. The trade had survived the rise of the factory, the suburbanization of American life, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression, and emerged from each disruption substantially intact. A young man with patience and steady hands could walk into a cobbler shop at 16 and walk out a journeyman at 23. He would own a business, support a family, and serve a community for the rest of his working life. Then came the chain that this channel has traced across so many other American trades, except that this time the chain compressed the destruction into a single working decade entirely. The first force was imports, beginning in the late 1960s, as cheap mass-produced footwear from Asia began arriving in American mass-market retail at unprecedented volumes. The imports came first from Japan, then from Taiwan and South Korea, then from China, and eventually from Vietnam and Indonesia across roughly 5 decades of expansion. Each new import source produced footwear at lower cost than the previous generation, undercutting the American footwear industry at every price point and consumer category. By 1970, more than 30% of footwear sold in the United States was imported. The imported shoes were not built to be repaired, with glued soles, foam cushioning, and synthetic materials that cannot be reworked using traditional cobbler techniques and tools. When the imported shoes wore out, customers threw them away rather than repaired them, and the cobbler had nothing to service for the residential market that had supported his trade. The second force was the cultural redefinition of footwear as a disposable consumer product, with shoe marketing campaigns trained American consumers to buy new shoes every season. Major brands invested hundreds of millions of dollars in convincing consumers that fashion turnover, not durability, was the right purchase driver for footwear at every price point. The advertising of the period explicitly framed older durable shoes as outdated, frumpy, or unfashionable, and the marketing worked across the American consumer base of every generation. Fashion turnover replaced durability as the dominant purchase driver in the American footwear economy, with new styles arriving every season and old styles discarded immediately. A shoe that was supposed to last 5 years in 1960 was replaced by a shoe that was supposed to last 1 year in 1990. The cobbler depended on the durable shoe, and when the durable shoe disappeared from the mass market, the cobbler's residential customer base disappeared with it across 1 generation. The third force was the schools, with the vocational counseling literature of the 1970s and 1980s listing cobbling among the trades that should be avoided. The literature called the trade obsolete and recommended that students pursue 4-year college degrees instead, framing the cobbler as a relic of an earlier and less prosperous era. Some guidance manuals went so far as to describe the cobbler trade as a fringe occupation unworthy of consideration by motivated American teenagers in any community across the country. The framing ignored the fact that cobblers in 1970 still earned middle-class wages and owned their own shops, with steady customer bases that had served families for generations. The high school programs that had once introduced young Americans to the cobbler trade were shut down state by state across the 1980s and 1990s without much public. By the year 2000, almost no American public high school still taught any form of shoemaking or shoe repair. By 2010, the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics had folded cobblers into a broader category that combined them with other small trades, eliminating the distinct statistical category. The destruction was almost total. The 90% reduction was concentrated in the 20-year window between the late 1980s and the late 2000s, with most shop closures after 1995. The mass-market shoe brands benefited from billions of dollars in incremental sales from disposable footwear sold to American consumers across the country at every income level. The imported shoe manufacturers benefited, the chain footwear retailers benefited, and the universities benefited, as the federal student loan portfolio grew to $1.7 trillion. The cobbler was not in the brochure. The cost was paid by every main street in America. The customer had to drive 40 miles, 60 miles, or 100 miles to find a working shop, and many customers simply gave up and bought new disposable shoes instead. The local economy lost the cobbler's wages, the cobbler's customers lost the cobbler's hours, and the next generation lost the cobbler's knowledge across communities in every region. The cost was also paid by every consumer who paid premium prices for branded leather shoes that could not be repaired locally. The trade did not die from lack of demand. It was killed by a combination of imports, cultural redefinition of footwear, and the deliberate removal of training programs from schools. The demand for repairable footwear never disappeared from the American market. It was simply suppressed by marketing campaigns that pushed disposable products at every price point available. The customer who would have spent $50 to resole a quality pair of shoes was retrained over 20 years to throw the shoes away and buy a new pair. Now open the archive on what remains, because the cobbler trade has been slowly stabilizing since the late 2010s, with three forces driving the partial recovery now underway nationally. The first force is the resurgence of premium and luxury footwear. The second force is the environmental movement, which makes disposable footwear less acceptable to educated consumers who increasingly value durability over fashion turnover in the marketplace. The third force is the simple fact that the cobblers who remain have very little competition, with each surviving shop now serving a customer base that extends across multiple counties. A skilled cobbler operating a small independent shop in a major American city commonly earns between $70,000 and $130,000 a year in routine work. A specialist in luxury and designer shoe restoration can earn between $100,000 and $200,000 a year, serving collectors and high-end customers at premium rates. A specialist in vintage and antique footwear restoration can bill between $100 and $300 an hour on detailed work, with contracts that often run into the thousands. A specialist in custom orthopedic and medical footwear takes contracts at very high margins, serving podiatrists across the country who report difficulty finding qualified cobblers for prescription work. The medical and orthopedic segment is particularly underserved, and a cobbler with the right medical orthotic training can build a sustainable practice serving local physicians on referral basis. The work is recession-proof in a way most office work has never been, with the recession of 2008 actually increasing demand for repair over replacement. The pandemic of 2020 did the same, as homebound Americans rediscovered their existing footwear and invested in repair rather than purchase across the lockdown period in the country. The arrival of large language models in 2022 and 2023 did not threaten a single working American cobbler in any town or city. A factory can mass-produce shoes, but it cannot repair them. The path back into the trade is shorter than the path through any four-year college program. Most modern American cobblers learn through direct apprenticeship with a working shop, paid from day one, with tuition for full training programs between $3,000 and $12,000. Compare that to the average cost of a four-year college degree, which now sits above $100,000 for most American institutions of selectivity. The math favors the cobbler trade by an order of magnitude. Within 3 to 5 years, a cobbler who specializes in luxury, custom, or restoration work routinely earns between $80,000 and $150,000 annually nationwide. A cobbler shop in a major American city today can serve hundreds of regular customers. The shop on Main Street in tens of thousands of American towns is gone. The benches are silent. But the trade is not dead. The trade was never the problem. Every economic decision can be revisited by the person standing at the cobbler bench, all in hand. If this vault opened something for you, leave a comment with the trade you wish your school had taught you instead of college prep. The next vault holds a trade that built the woodwork of every American small town for 2 centuries, surviving every economic shock of the 19th and 20th centuries with ease. The Federal Department of Education classified the trade as low growth in the 1970s, and within a generation, the schools had stopped teaching it almost entirely across the country. The next vault opened soon,